And this is what everyone needs to know. They need to know that America fought a war to end slavery. Hundreds of thousands of Americans died to do it. Britain sent the Royal Navy to the other side of the world to stop people enslaving. Money was spent, sailors lost their lives to end this practice, which has existed for thousands of years since the dawn of human civilization. Welcome back to History Revealed. Today I'm going to be reacting to Matt Walsh and the Daily Wire's Real History. This promises to be a counter-narrative to the prevailing view of American history for the past few decades. Now, lots of you have requested that I do a reaction to this video, so let's get to it. Let's begin.
For more than half a century, anti-American propagandists have waged a demoralization campaign against us. Generations of Americans have been force-fed lies designed to beat us into a state of submission and self-loathing. We've been taught to hate ourselves, to hate the West, and to hate the figures, mostly white, mostly male, who built America.
So, first observation is that he is very much correct that it goes beyond America. It's not just hating America, it's hating the West as a whole, because America is only a young country and it's a product of Western civilization, specifically sort of Anglo-Saxon, British civilization at the beginning. And, we could go into great detail about sort of the other factors that encompass that, Protestantism, the Enlightenment, but it's all encompassing, sort of the hatred, the things that have been taught in the last few decades, scaled up over time. So astute observation there.
We're all familiar with their narrative. America is uniquely evil because of racism, slavery, colonialism, imperialism, and so on. They've waged intellectual warfare against...
And this is the thing. The standard America is held to, you could apply it to Britain or France or sort of any other Western country really, is this really unfair sort of unique standard, which is the so-called crimes of slavery, imperialism, racism, whatever, even though they're common to every major civilization ever, and the smaller ones as well. Somehow it's the fact that they took place in these countries is far worse, and they must be morally condemned for it. Whereas with others, it's just, oh, that's just history. That's how it was back then. So the application of double standards is a huge part of this.
Our founding fathers and national heroes. They desecrated their reputations, tore down their statues. Their rewriting of history is such...
Yeah, I don't know about you guys, but sort of watching the statues being torn down was sort of gave me a visceral feeling, visceral disgust when I saw that happening. Sort of the disregard for history and the sort of sadistic pleasure of the crowd was particularly hard. And of course, there are many cases of this.
Flagrant propaganda that would make Pravda blush. That doesn't mean that it's not pervasive or successful. One professor from the University of Wisconsin spent 11 years administering historical literacy tests to his students. He discovered that they overwhelmingly believed that slavery began in the U.S., was almost exclusively an American phenomenon. A view shared, by the way, with at least one...
Yeah, just a casual glance at American discourse around slavery, particularly sort of 5-6 years ago when things really kicked off. Many people believed that. They had no concept that slavery, especially, existed outside of at least North America, and that there were slaves in history who weren't black, who didn't have white masters. It was so sort of myopic and narrow, the focus, that, many people did believe that. And to be honest, I doubt too much has changed. Maybe the people who watch my channel know that's not true. But I imagine there are many Americans who still believe this, and even if they understand intrinsically that yes, slavery did exist in other countries, when you say slavery to them, their immediate concept of it is white master, black slave, and I think that's very deeply ingrained.
One Washington Post poll found that a 67% majority of the public says the legacy of slavery affects American society today.
That question every black person gets, which is slavery was a long time.
Oh my God, right. In case you don't know, few people have done more to damage American society in the past few years than this woman. This is Nikole Hannah-Jones. She's very much the Wicked Witch of Western civilization. She used to write for the New York Times, and she was the creator of the 1619 Project. Now, this was a work of pure historical fabrication. She claimed that in 1619, that was the true founding of the United States, not 1776. because in 1619 is when the first slave arrived in America. To her, slavery was America's original sin, and it forever bore the mark of Cain because of it. Everything that came henceforth was marred by slavery. She even argued that the American Revolution itself occurred to protect slavery, not for any of the other reasons we all know. And please, please do not underestimate the influence she had. She won a Pulitzer Prize for this nonsense. The 1619 Project was used in school curricula, it was used in universities, in documentaries, in journalism, so its reach and the damage it caused is incredibly hard to understate. Real tragedy for America that this woman ever had the influence that she did.
Time ago, why don't you get over it? How do you get over something that is as foundational to your society as anything can be foundational?
We've been told that the history of slavery is straightforward and uncontroversial. We've been told that black slaves were mostly captured by whites, that white colonists in the Americas routinely enslaved free black men, and that more black people were enslaved than whites. And we've been told that we're not allowed to question any of that. Well, enough.
I say that's true, but it's more a lie by omission. So you won't have people explicitly saying these things, but the parameters of the conversation are so narrow that it's hard to come away thinking anything other than the things he just mentioned.
Historians and political pundits spend a lot of time talking about the transatlantic slave trade, the 350-year period in which an estimated 12.5 million slaves were brought to the Americas. But what we don't learn in school is where those slaves actually went. Just under half of them, an estimated 5.4 million, went only to Brazil.
So this is a very important detail. And the reason this is not only because it sort of shifts the sort of moral culpability sort of away from sort of the British colonies in North America, at least somewhat. I mean, you could argue that the country that imported the most slaves, at least in the eyes of certain sort of historians and activists, is more morally culpable because it imported the most. However, the argument that is often used is America's wealth was built on the back of slavery, which isn't true. And one of the sort of elements of the argument which proves it isn't true is the fact that far, far more slaves went to Brazil. As we can see, 5.4 million. Brazil is not a wealthy country. It wasn't a wealthy country then. It's not a wealthy country now. So if it imported over 10 times more slaves than the United States did, shouldn't that mean it was 10 times wealthier, or at least 5 times wealthier, maybe twice as wealthy? But it's not. So significantly undermines the argument that America's wealth was built off the back of slaves.
Many more went to the Caribbean. 1.2 million went to Jamaica, more than 900,000 to St. Dominique, and 889,000 to Cuba. The grand total of slaves brought to the future United States was about half the number brought only to Cuba, 472,372, or 3% of the total. The ones who came to the 13 colonies were the lucky ones. In the context of global slavery, getting put on a ship to New Orleans was really a best-case scenario. If you think American slavery was bad, wait until you see what happened to the ones who didn't make it here. And we'll show you.
Okay, I feel that this is going to move to Africa pretty soon, because it might seem like a provocative statement to say they were the lucky ones, but when you see what happened to the ones left behind in Africa, you'll understand why he says this.
That over the course of this video. But first we start with a West African country you've likely never heard of, the Kingdom of Dahomey.
Yes, this is brilliant. This is brilliant. If even a tenth of the people who sort of criticize America and the West for their role in the Atlantic slave trade had even heard of the Kingdom of Dahomey, we'd be having a very different debate. This was, one of the most violent, sort of ritualistic and in many ways sadistic kingdoms of Africa, of pre-colonial Africa, that existed. A major player in the Atlantic slave trade who was rounding up slaves and shipping them off to the Americas for a handsome profit, of course. And I won't ruin too much because I feel he's about to talk about the sort of things they got up to.
Dahomey was not a peripheral player in the Atlantic slave trade. It was central to it. The kingdom's wealth, its military power, and its cultural splendor were built entirely on the systematic capture, sale, and export of human beings. By the end of the kingdom,
the great irony is that, like I mentioned before, the West is accused of building its wealth on the back of slavery, which isn't true. However, Dahomey most certainly built their wealth on the back of it.
An estimated 1.9 million slaves came from West African coastline controlled by the Dahomey. The kingdom obtained its slaves by waging perpetual warfare upon its neighbors. In the 19th century, a Dahomeyan king named Gezo described the slave trade as the ruling principle of my people. It is the source of their glory and health. Their songs celebrate their victories, and the mother lulls the child to sleep with notes of triumph over an enemy reduced to slavery.
Now, an important context for this quote is that he said it to a British representative who was encouraging him to abolish the slave trade. So this was a defense of the slave trade on his part. By this point, the Europeans, and specifically the British, had morally turned against slavery and the slave trade, but he certainly hadn't.
Now, in many cases, the Kingdom of Dahomey obtained these slaves by deploying an all-female military unit called the Dahomey Amazons. They were the chief slave catchers of the empire. The Amazons would raid nearby towns and return with large contingents of slaves, along with the heads of anyone who resisted.
So there is a brilliant account from a former American slave called Cudjoe Lewis, who describes the horror and the terror of what happened when the Dahomey Amazons raided his village, slaughtered people, and then took him off into slavery. And yet, in Hollywood, in popular culture, the Dahomey Amazons were portrayed as heroes, as defending their land from Europeans. And I'm talking about the film The Woman King, which only came out in the last couple of years. So, the historical record on the Dahomey Amazons and the Kingdom of Dahomey has been well known for a long time. And yet, when it was portrayed in Hollywood, it was completely distorted.
The Dahomey Amazons ran roughshod over the region. An American missionary named Jacob Bauer discovered 18 depopulated towns over 60 miles near the territory of Dahomey. The death toll was massive. Gezo, the king we mentioned earlier, built a palace called the Singboji, which used human skulls for bricks and human blood as mortar.
Yep, and this was confirmed with DNA studies that took place in the last few years. They tested the mortar. Actual human blood, also chicken blood, was found inside. Unbelievable, like truly unbelievable. And it had been rumored for a long time that that's what they'd done. However, there were people who thought, oh, that could be the European accounts exaggerating their brutality for propagandistic purposes. But we have solid DNA evidence that human blood was used in the building of the royal palace in the city of Abomi.
Assuming you survived a Dahomey raid, which wasn't likely, or taken captive, it was far preferable to be sold to Europeans than to remain in Dahomey. Slaves.
So one of the things you've got to remember is that this was religion for Dahomey. This was of sacred importance to sacrifice humans. They practiced voodoo in Dahomey, so that was the religious convictions that they had. And yeah, it's sort of alien to our sort of modern understanding of it, and it was certainly alien to sort of the Christian understanding of the Europeans who encountered this. I mean, you can read their accounts of just, especially the later ones, just the utter horror that they had when they saw this stuff.
Enemy chiefs. Assuming you survived a Dahomey raid, which wasn't likely, or taken captive, it was far preferable to be sold to Europeans than to remain in Dahomey. Slaves they couldn't sell or that they didn't want anymore were subjected to torture and public executions. That's because the Dahomeyans believed that they could communicate with the gods through human sacrifice. On average, they dispatched about 500 people a year. Roughly 10% were killed at the annual custom, a yearly mass slaughter. In 1893, the Sacramento Daily Union.
Yeah, annual customs of Dahomey were just absolutely horrific event. And I'm sure he's about to go into detail about what exactly occurred.
Reported, quote, hundreds are annually put to death with the most savage tortures. They are dismembered limb by limb. They are tied to posts, and hounds are set to worry them to death. They are securely fastened to the ground near the nests of the ferocious ants of the country that attack them and tear their flesh bit by bit away. The spectacle of a still living man with his body half eaten by the ants being not infrequently seen.
Yeah, exactly. And there's all sorts of accounts saying a similar thing. One such account was a British man named Captain Forbes, who went to Dahomey and saw they were about to sacrifice a small child, a young girl. And he managed to negotiate with the king to release her. And he took her back to Britain with her. And this woman, whose name was Sarah Forbes Bonetta, became the goddaughter of Queen Victoria, and didn't end her life as a sacrifice, but went on to marry and was very intelligent. She became educated and later became a missionary.
Such gruesome accounts were an ironic outcome of European powers ending the slave trade decades earlier, unsellable slaves were only useful as human sacrifices.
Okay, I'd say that's probably the first mistake he's made so far. Not a huge one, but it is a mistake. Dahomey was sacrificing humans long before the slave trade was abolished by Europeans. They were doing it while selling slaves abroad. It really depended on the time whether they used them to sell or whether they used them for human sacrifices. But it certainly wasn't the case that that the ceasing to be able to sell them to Europeans, shipping them off abroad, meant that more were being slaughtered at home. That wasn't the only reason. Like, we have accounts of huge numbers of people being sacrificed while slavery was thriving. So a bit of a mistake there.
But the annual mass execution festivals weren't even the most brutal event in Dahomey. According to the Sacramento Daily Union, they were, quote, far surpassed by the scenes which take place when the new monarch is crowned. 500 to 1,000 men are put to death in order to provide the deceased king with a suitable retinue in the other world.
Yeah, as if they couldn't stoop any lower. This absolutely used to happen, and it's because of the role that the king played, the king of Dahomey, in the voodoo religion. Is that sort of he was a sort of semi-divine figure, and it was in his mind and in sort of the society's mind, it was a great honor for these people to be sacrificed to accompany him in the afterlife, or to celebrate the new king who would succeed him. Again, completely alien to sort of Western understanding, but deeply believed in Dahomey.
They butchered thousands of slaves as an offering to their king. Slavery and barbarism were a fundamental part of their culture.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that really should be understood by sort of modern American society, that this was the Africa that the slaves were leaving.
Now, it's worth noting here that although black Africans themselves did have slaves and routinely sold slaves, they weren't big players in the transoceanic transportation of slaves. They also didn't participate in the raids on the coast of Europe that we'll address later in this episode. That's because, quite frankly, they just didn't have the technology to do that.
Yeah, another important point is that their ability to enslave and export slaves was limited not by desire, but by technology and logistics.
But that's never addressed by mainstream historians, nor are the details on.
There are historians who address that. John Thornton, a historian I'm a big fan of, who's a real expert on slavery in pre-colonial Africa, very much addresses that.
Enslavers in Dahomey. Consider, for example,
although it is almost certainly not addressed in American public discourse, and the historians that are invited on to the various documentaries, I'm sure, don't mention it.
Ken Burns' recent PBS documentary on the American Revolution, where he uses passive voice to creatively skirt the question of who exactly did the enslaving.
Tens of thousands were from West Africa, captured from what is now Senegal, Gambia, and Gabon, Angola, Congo, and the Ivory Coast, Nigeria, Cameroon, and Ghana.
It would be
Voila, exactly. And that's a shame. It's a shame that Ken Burns did that, because his documentary on the American Civil War from, I think it was the 90s, was incredible. And the fact he's overlooked, as so many do, such an important element of the transatlantic slave trade, of the history of the United States, is that Africans enslaved other Africans and sold them to America, to Brazil, to the Caribbean, to the British Empire, the French Empire, the Portuguese Empire, so on and so forth. Just completely overlooked it. It's hard to say that's an accident.
Convenient for propagandists like Burns to point out that the slaves were already enslaved by other Africans, mostly women, by the way. That reality makes the white guilt narrative a little less straightforward. And if they did mention it, they'd also be obliged to point out another inconvenient fact, that the horrors of Dahomey ended in 1894 because French colonizers invaded the country and burned the royal palace.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Walsh. That is exactly right. What is also left out is the story of how slavery came to an end in Africa. And as you can see, it was done at the end of European bayonets. Not through any moral awakening of the Africans, but through conquest, through colonization, or heavy diplomatic and economic pressure.
The French, who freed their slaves in 1848, built hospitals, schools, instituted social services, mostly
also in Dahomey, it was the French who abolished human sacrifice
through Catholic missionaries.
And, not to bore you about the French in Dahomey, but the the French general who captured Dahomey in 1898, I believe it was half black. Bet you didn't expect that. Anyway, moving on.
It's a statistical reality that every living white person has ancestors who were enslaved. But a great deal of white slavery was not done by fellow Europeans. This is the town of Baltimore in County Cork, Ireland.
He's absolutely right. At some point in history, everyone has been the enslaver and everyone has been the enslaved in terms of their ancestry, in terms of who was committing the act of enslavement and who was being enslaved. It's every combination has been done. Contrary to sort of what popular culture might constantly imply, that is very much the case. Now, he mentions Baltimore, not the Baltimore in America, but I imagine this is about to discuss the raid on Baltimore in 1631, because there is no other reason you would mention Baltimore in Ireland.
The tranquility of its rocky shoreline was shattered on the night of June 20th, 1631. That evening, at precisely 2 o'clock in the morning, Islamic pirates led by a commander named Morat the Younger arrived banging war drums and screaming in Arabic. They arrived on 2 large raiding vessels flying.
Because these were the Barbary pirates, possibly the most underreported and understudied sort of subjects in history, particularly in European history, yet one of the most consequential.
And crescent moon flags, one 300-ton flagship equipped with 200 men and 24 pieces of ordnance, including 12 cannons on each side, and a smaller, more maneuverable 100-ton ship with 6 iron guns on each side. It came as...
Yes, and these details that he's giving about the ships are very important because these pirates were incredibly well armed. They were effectively the navies, not officially, but effectively the navies of nations in North Africa, of the Barbary states, which is modern-day Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, also Morocco, although Morocco, crucially, wasn't under the protection of the Ottoman Empire like Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli was.
A shock to the Irish villagers, who were mostly fishermen. According to a book called The Stolen Village, quote, none of these untraveled fisher folk would ever have seen anything like the Turkish warriors with their flashing scimitars, their swirling, flowing robes with distinctive cowls, the torchlight glistening on the sweat of bare arms, which they contemptuously left unprotected by armor. Storm them, my brave ones, some of the Janissaries would have been yelling, while others responded with shouts of Allah, Allah.
And this is crucial because there are many different reasons people enslave other people and categories which they sort of apply. So famously, as has been mentioned in the Americas, it was race. You had black slaves, white masters. For the Barbary pirates, these were Islamic pirates enslaving non-Muslims, which was mostly Christians, sometimes Jews, in Europe. Now, in Islam, you can't enslave another Muslim, really. So they didn't target Muslim ships or Muslim towns in the Mediterranean, but they very much went for Christian ones like Ireland and Baltimore in this case.
These pirates were Janissaries, and they were raised from a young age to become fearsome monk-like fighters for the...
The Janissaries, of course, are the most elite troops in the Ottoman army. And he's about to explain, I'm sure, how they become Janissaries, how someone becomes a Janissary. And I warn you, it's a rough story.
Ottoman Empire. Their story offers a good look into the proliferation of slavery. The forced levy of Christians to become Janissaries is called the Devshir Meh system, and it involved the kidnapping of hundreds of thousands of Christian boys over the 300 years that it was in place. After they were kidnapped, they were forcibly converted to Islam. They were extraordinarily disciplined and well-equipped. They carried muskets and pistols, carried in a red scarf tied around their waist, as well as their signature double-curved blades. The Janissaries had...
Yeah, and this is like I mentioned, like with the Barbary pirates, completely underreported story. If you go to the Balkans, they know all about the Janissaries. This is a very sort of emotional and sort of traumatic part of their history, because if you're Greek, Serbian, Bulgarian, name a few others, Romanian, there are even reports of Poles and Hungarians becoming Janissaries, where they would kidnap young Christian boys. They'd go into a town of Greeks and just see which boys looked healthy and fit, and they would just steal them from their parents and force them to become Muslim. And often these children would be raised to fight the very people who they belong to. And we have accounts of Christian accounts saying how awful this was, and how dreadful it was that these kids had become so alienated from their parents and from their communities, and they were forced to become sort of lifelong soldiers. Now, the reason this was done is because the Sultan wanted absolute loyalty of his elite troops. So if they had no connection to sort of the Turkish families or the sort of Turkish society, it made them much more loyal. By the way, that didn't stop them getting involved in politics. They often did, but for the most part, they were loyal to the Sultan.
Preparing silently for precisely this moment. And when that moment arrived, the Janissaries were prepared. The villagers were not. Outnumbered 10-1, the citizens of Baltimore never stood a chance. Neither did the British Navy, which was responsible for patrolling the coast and protecting villages like Baltimore from attack.
Another crucial detail there, that the Barbary pirates were very difficult to stop even for the conventional navies of the various European powers, because at this point in time, their navies were not much better than what the Barbary pirates had. The warships that each had available were very similar in quality, and the pirates were very good sailors, unfortunately for the Europeans. So, I mean, Baltimore has its own sort of specific context and its own specific sort of reasons why the Navy was unable to stop them. But this was a story across Europe.
The British knew through good intelligence gathering in Algiers that the Janissaries were planning an attack, but expected it to happen at a much larger and wealthier town called Kinsale, 50 miles away. Through a captured and likely tortured fisherman, the Janissaries learned that the British fleet had left Baltimore unguarded, and they planned to move into the interior of the country to collect more Irish slaves. But Irish ingenuity claimed the day. Resourceful villagers gathered nearby, collected firearms and rum, and started making as much noise as possible. This convinced the pirates that an English army was marching on them, and they retreated from Baltimore, limiting themselves to around 100 slaves. The raid on Baltimore is unique because of where it happened, but such raids into Europe were fairly common. In 16...
Absolutely. And I feel he's about to cover just how common they were and what a devastating impact they had.
1827, for example, corsairs took 5 ships in a raid on remote Heimaey Island in Iceland.
Yes, exactly. They even got as far as Iceland. Bear in mind, they're coming from North Africa. Like, very few places in Europe were safe. Obviously, Southern Europe was devastated by this stuff. But, you know, the Irish mainland was attacked. And now, as he mentioned, even Iceland was attacked.
Total ferocity. They killed and maimed, they raped the women and girls, dismembered infants, desecrated churches, and slaughtered a priest at prayer.
This is incredibly important too. I know I say a lot of details are important, but this really is. These were depopulation events. The brutality was off the scale when they attacked. And for the women in particular, when they got back to Algiers or Tripoli or wherever it was a nasty experience, because they would become concubines. So if the sexual crimes that had already been committed wasn't enough, they had to live a lifelong sort of ordeal of lack of consent, shall we say. Let's not get the video in trouble. Lack of consent, sort of having to satisfy the whims of their masters. It was a dreadful time for them. And white European women were highly valued. They fetched a high price at slave markets. So yeah, the dehumanization and the was major part of this.
They burned and looted everything in sight, and, quote, settled down to a long, unhurried orgy of rape, mutilation, and murder, which seems to have been motivated by nothing more than sadistic sport. One account tells of the corsairs cutting people in half and callously snapping the necks of infants. Anyone unable to keep up with their pace was cut down, and in their madness for blood, these villains then chopped and hacked the bodies into small pieces with the greatest enjoyment and lust for blood, wrote one eyewitness.
So the brutality and the sadism really was there. And you only have to look at sort of notable events, and maybe he'll bring them up, like the attack on Viest in the 16th century, pardon me, 17th century, because what was it, 16th? What happened at Viest was that almost the entire town was either massacred or taken off into slavery. We talk about thousands of people killed. And then you've got what happened on the island of Gozo in the 16th century, because Gozo is one of the Maltese islands. The entire island was depopulated. Normally, it's the case of women and children taken off into slavery. The men were massacred. So, really, an apocalyptic event. And this description doesn't apply to Gozo necessarily, but it would fit. It would fit very well. These were very much apocalyptic in nature for the people who lived through them.
In that particular raid on Iceland, the Corsairs kidnapped half the island's population. They murdered 1 in 12 villagers, including several priests. All in all, they returned to Algiers with roughly 400 slaves taken from the coast of Iceland. And along the way, they would seize church bells and attach them to the masts of their ships as trophies.
Yeah, it was sort of financially motivated in many ways, but also sort of religiously motivated. Sort of, as he mentions, it was about humiliation of Christians as much as anything else. And some of these people would eventually be freed, and not out of the goodness of their heart, but a way that many Europeans would become free who were slaves in North Africa was through ransoms. And these were, incredibly expensive ransoms generally, often over a year's worth of income to pay for them, but there was sometimes a route to freedom on those lines.
7 Days, the historian Des Ecken writes, the typical medium-sized Corsair ship usually seized 5 vessels, enslaved nearly 100 Englishmen, and stole roughly 60,000 pounds.
Yeah, so the enslavement of Europeans didn't just happen on land, but also at sea. So they would attack Christian ships, all sorts of ships, fishermen, cargo vessels, whatever it may be, and they stole their cargo, but the most valuable cargo was that of the humankind, which of course they sold into the slave markets.
Victims who weren't killed, in many cases, became galley slaves. Since the Roman era, galley slaves were...
Yes, and this is just truly horrific. Now, the best historian on the Barbary pirates is a man named Robert Davis, and Robert Davis describes galley slavery as the most brutal form of slavery ever devised. If you were a galley slave, a European galley slave on a Barbary pirate ship or an Ottoman ship, because the Ottoman Navy heavily used Christian galley slaves, this was hell on earth. This was hell on earth. The death was probably a better fate. You would be chained to the bench where you'd be rowing. You would probably rarely see the light of day. The stench was horrific. You were barely fed. Sometimes you'd be exposed to the sun, so your skin would burn. And there was no end to this. It was for life, and you weren't paid. Your only release was either death or, in some extraordinary circumstances, especially if you're on a warship, that you got captured by a Christian enemy.
Considered the most effective way to keep the galleys moving, since they required coordinated rowing. If anyone took a break, they'd make the ship much less efficient. Webb notes that after a naval battle in 1571 between the Ottoman Empire and the Holy League, which included Spain and Venice, it became evident just how many Christians had been forced to row boats for the Ottomans and what horrific conditions these galley slaves had to endure. Following the battle, the Holy League discovered that more than 12,000 European Christians had been forced to row the galleys for the Ottomans. They were shackled 24 hours a day. They were not afforded the opportunity to lie down to sleep, not that there was any room to do so in any event. Webb writes that, quote,
yeah, and this was the Battle of Lepanto, which was possibly the largest naval battle ever in terms of personnel. There's a few candidates for that particular honor. And the Holy League defeated the Ottomans, and many of the ships that were captured by the Holy League had thousands of Christian galley slaves, as Mr. Walsh mentions, and they were freed. So that was one of the rare occasions where the just incredible ordeal that they went through had a happy ending. And this was this was actually sort of part of the sort of the glory of victory for the Holy League. Is not only did they defeat the navy of what was probably the most powerful sort of nation in the world at the time, sort of the menace of Europe, the Ottoman Empire, but also the fact they were able to free thousands of Christians in their victory.
Not all slaves were forced to row the galleys. After returning to Algiers, some slaves, men, women, and children, were put up for the auction. Children as young as 12 years old were sold as concubines. In a normal auction, children younger than 7 could sell for over 100 pounds, roughly double the asking.
Yeah, and that is another grim reality of this, is that children were often used in harems, boys and girls.
Price for an attractive woman. Between 1500 and 1800 AD, the Ottomans and their North African corsairs, also called Barbary pirates, likely enslaved roughly 1.5 million people from Christian Europe. Unlike the transatlantic slave trade, which was driven by pure profit, the Barbary raids on Europe were motivated by bloodlust and hatred. One historian described it as revenge, almost a jihad, for the expulsion of Muslims from Spain in 1492, for the centuries of crusading violence that had preceded them, and for the ongoing religious struggle between Christians and Muslims.
Yeah, and see, that's the quote from Robert Davis, again, like I mentioned before, the best historian of the Barbary pirates, in my opinion. And this is the thing to remember, that this was not just money driven, but this is part of an ongoing sort of civilizational struggle between sort of Islam and Christianity in Europe and Africa at that time. So it added a real sort of zeal to the Barbary pirates. You know, they weren't doing this for cash as such, but ideology. And now I wonder if he'll mention the Thomas Jefferson quote, which I won't say just yet, because if he mentions it, it's incredibly relevant.
In the first half of the 17th century, Barbary slavers were sailing through the English Channel and into the Thames estuary, plundering local shipping and coastal towns, such that, as the minutes of Parliament put it, the fishermen are afraid to put to sea. We're forced to keep continual watch on all our coasts. By 1640, at least 3,000 British nationals were enslaved in Algiers alone. In just the 7-year stretch from 1609 to 1616, 466 English ships were, quote, boarded and the crews taken to North Africa as slaves. In April 1625, 3 ships from Cornwall and 1 sailing from Dartmouth in Devon were captured by corsairs and the crews taken.
Yep, the Barbary pirates occupied an island in the Bristol Channel for several years. The southwest of England particularly sort of has a real history with Barbary pirates, with sort of like Islamic piracy, and it's been completely forgotten. Completely. You will never hear this in sort of British documentaries, history books, and I don't think it's necessarily intentional, or maybe you'll tell me it is, but I don't know why it's not mentioned. But for whatever reason, that threat is just ignored.
As bad as it was to be in British waters, it was worse in southern Europe. Muslim raids on the northern shore of the Mediterranean were almost annual events of terror and pillage. In 1544, in the Bay of Naples, Algerians took 6,000 captives. 6,000 more Italians were taken during the sack of Vieste.
There you go. Yeah, he mentions the sack of Vieste. Now, it's also relevant to remember that this changed the geography of southern Europe in many ways, of human settlement, because having coastal towns was much more dangerous, and the cost of fortifying them and manning the fortifications was a huge burden for southern Europe. So it massively affected the prosperity of much of the southern part of the continent, where you've got people being stolen all the time from land and from the sea. So when you put ships out to sea, you can't have the level of shipping that you ordinarily would have, because there's a danger that the ship and the crews will be stolen by pirates. And then the cost of having a navy to protect those ships is very high. So, it's not until the Barbary pirates are conclusively defeated in the sort of early to mid 19th century that the Mediterranean becomes sort of free of piracy, sort of the first time in hundreds of years. So the long-term effects of Barbary piracy are massive.
Calabria. In 1566, they took 4,000 slaves in Granada, Spain, in a single raid. They described it as raining Christians in Algiers.
Yeah, there's another account, not specifically from Algiers, but they say that because of an influx of Christian slaves, that a Christian is worth the price of an onion. That's how cheap they're able to sell them because of the abundance.
1,200 men in Madeira in 1636, another 700 in Calabria, Italy, then 1,000 more in 1639, and 4,000 more in 1644. In 1683, the French military attempted to free some of the slaves being held in Algiers.
If he mentions what I think he's going to mention, you're about to hear a story of a man who was fired out of a cannon, and I'm not joking.
The Algerians didn't take kindly to it. Quote, infuriated at their helplessness in the face of such an attack, the Algerians decided to vent their anger upon those Frenchmen who were at their mercy, including Jean Lavache. Algiers had, at the time, the most powerful cannon in the whole of the Mediterranean. It weighed 12 tons. The 23-foot-long gun had a range of 3 miles. The unfortunate French consul was pushed partly into the barrel, the cannon then being discharged with a load of shrapnel, blowing him to pieces. The Algerians found 22 other Frenchmen and tied them to the muzzles of other guns and killed them the same way.
Yeah, and this was a theme whenever the Europeans confronted the Barbary pirates. Maybe he'll mention it as well. But during the raid on Algiers in 1816, I believe it was, when an Anglo-Dutch fleet attacked, one of the reasons they did that is because fishermen, I think it was basically like Corsican, Sardinian fishermen under British protection, were just massacred by the Algerians. And their brutality, like even for a time when sort of brutality was the norm, their brutality was on a different level, and it really shocked the Europeans.
Now, for the most part, these slaves, unless they were ransomed or executed inside a cannon, spent the rest of their lives in North Africa and the Ottoman Empire, which incidentally is one of those colonial empires that no one on the left seems to mind, assuming they're even aware of it.
Very true. Very true. European empires get lambasted relentlessly, whereas the Ottoman Empire, which bear in mind didn't just enslave many Europeans, but it ended in a triple genocide. The Armenians, the Greeks, and the Assyrians. That's how this empire went down. The British Empire ended peacefully with a ceremony in Hong Kong. The Ottoman Empire ended in a triple genocide. That's what the Ottoman Empire was. And the legacy of people love to talk about the legacies of empires. It would never be accepted. It would never be accepted if Bulgarians, for example, made the argument that Bulgaria is not a wealthy country or it has structural problems because it was under Turkish rule for about 500 years. That would never be accepted. Whereas African countries are, well, it's often not the Africans claiming it, often it's sort of Western intellectuals claiming that's the reason that African countries are poor or they're dysfunctional. It's because of the legacy of European empires. Bit of a double standard.
One of the most shocking slave trades did not involve Europeans at all. It involved an Arab-run slave trade operation in East Africa, roughly around the same time as the Middle Passage was bringing slaves from places like Dahomey to Brazil.
I'm really pleased he's mentioning this. He's doing a great job with sort of covering these different slave trades involving non-Europeans and sort of explaining their evils and their reasons for existing. Yes, the East African slave trade was, brutal in its own special way, as I'm sure we're about to find out.
Unlike slaves arriving in the New World, Arabs frequently castrated male slaves to prevent them from breeding.
Oh, God, yes. And this is why you don't have large diaspora populations of black Africans in the Middle East and North Africa, in the Islamic world, the way you do in the New World, because they were prevented from reproducing, and the women were sort of absorbed into the rest of the population. So slaves in the United States and the Caribbean and South America were generally allowed to sort of get married and have families. Obviously, they could be split up, and it wasn't pleasant for them, but they had that sort of continuity. And of course, the United States actually banned the sort of importation of slaves relatively early, sort of early 19th century, and was reliant on the natural growth of the slave population. But the same fate cannot be said for the African slaves who were part of the East African slave trade who were enslaved by the Arabs, and the death rate with these practices. I don't want to go into too much detail because it's incredibly gruesome, but the death rate was very high.
The castration process was, in some cases, so brutal that 80 to 90% died during the operation. It wasn't just castration leading to mass deaths. Conditions were so brutal that 3 out of 4 died before even getting to market.
Yeah, the sort of the Middle Passage trip from Africa to the Americas is much focused on the cramped conditions of the slave ships. Is much focused on the journey from the African interior to North Africa or to the coast, depending on where it was incredibly brutal. And the Sahara or the African interior in general was just littered with skeletons from the slaves who couldn't make it, who died of exhaustion, died of heat stroke, whatever it was.
The African slave trade included legendary traders like the black ivory merchant Hamed bin Muhammad al-Murjbi, also known as Tipu Tip.
Now, I've made many videos about Tipu Tip before. How this man is not more well known in Western discourse is unbelievable, because this was one of the largest slave traders of the 19th century. He owned, we think, about 10,000 slaves at one point. He had plantations. He used ivory porters. I'm sure that's about to be discussed. There is no American slave owner, even the largest slave owner, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he owned about 1,000 slaves, and that was the largest one. Tipu Tip completely dwarfed him in his size, and whereas the largest slave owner in America was generally a businessman, this man was a warlord. He absolutely devastated the Eastern Congo.
By some estimates, as many as 17 million East Africans were sold into slavery over 1,300 years, dwarfing the transatlantic slave trade. Many of them worked spice fields and plantations in East.
Exact numbers are very difficult to come by because the Africans and the Arabs didn't keep records in anywhere near the same way as the Europeans did. And of course, this is from antiquity onwards. So these are very, very rough estimates. You'll see estimates that are far lower than that. It's not the point, really. Like, it's the exact numbers not so relevant. It's just the scale was truly staggering.
Africa, and the practice wasn't abolished until 1909. Once again, because of colonizers.
Yep. Another absolutely crucial point is that, as I mentioned before, it was only when Europeans actually sort of truly conquered the continent does slavery disappear for good. Been in Africa for thousands of years, and it wasn't going anywhere until these territories formally became sort of part of European empires.
Time from Britain. Now, the reality is that the East African slave trade, which exceeded the West African slave trade in its duration, barbarity, and quantity of slaves, has received relatively little attention from academics and journalists. That's because it's not a useful tool for a demoralization campaign against white Americans.
I can't help but agree with him there. I can't help but agree with him. Now, you might argue that, well, it's only natural that America focuses more on the transatlantic trade because, it came to American shores. And there is a black diaspora of those slaves still living in the United States. Now, I understand that. However, many of these people sort of appeal to universal principles when examining history. So if you appeal to universal principles, you need universal application. And that would mean focusing on other slave trades and doing it with the same sort of moral, moral sort of enthusiasm and that sort of condemnatory venom that they really go after America with. But no, when they talk about the East African slave trade or the Arab slave trade, the Barbary pirates, whatever, if they ever bring it up at all, it's all very sort of, it's like reading sort of the instruction manual to a new oven. Incredibly boring, very technical, no moral tone really at all. And so I think, again, he's absolutely right to point this out.
In 1800, there was not a single country on earth that had abolished slavery by law. Not one. By 1900, Britain, France, the United States, Denmark, the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal had all outlawed it.
Never forget that the moral awakening that's ended slavery happened in the West. Never forget that, because, as he points out, these are the countries that first abolished it. Now, Haiti is actually the first country that's ever abolished slavery after the Haitian Revolution was successful. But of course, they were influenced by French ideas, Enlightenment ideas, certainly not by African ones. And I'm sure we're about to cover, anti-slavery was a proselytizing idea in European and Western societies, and it was one that they would take round the world and sort of create a moral revolution. So let's get to that.
Every single abolition took place in societies under European control or heavy European pressure. In a perfect Orwellian twist of irony, it turns out white men are the heroes of the slavery story.
Yes, they are. Let's hear what he's got to say.
Africa squadron that freed hundreds of thousands of African slaves, all done at the expense of the British taxpayer. It was the nearly 400,000 Union soldiers who died in the American Civil War, and the entirely white Congress and white legislatures that passed the 13th Amendment.
And this is what everyone needs to know. They need to know that America fought a war to end slavery. Hundreds of thousands of Americans died to do it. Britain sent the Royal Navy to the other side of the world to stop people enslaving. Money was spent, sailors lost their lives to end this practice, which has existed for thousands of years since the dawn of human civilization. And it was Westerners, particularly sort of Anglo-Saxon countries, that did more than anyone to wipe this out from humanity. There's a reason it's not legal in any country in the world. It's because first Britain, then the United States came to dominate. And that morality, that completely novel morality, also came to dominate the world. Never, ever forget that. And never let anyone tell you you should be ashamed of your history as an American, ashamed of your history as a Brit or a Frenchman or whatever it may be, because in the past, whilst we might have done what everyone else did, we did what no one else did. And that was awaken morally and try and fix the problem that existed and then fix it for everyone else. And, fix it with the barrel of a gun if necessary.
Ending slavery. If the legacy of slavery is a permanent, unpayable debt that justifies racial redistribution in perpetuity, then literally every ethnic group on the planet owes every other one. The descendants of the Kingdom of Dahomey, which sold millions of their fellow Africans, would owe reparations to the descendants of their victims. The Arab world would owe West Africa and Europe. The Ottomans would owe the Balkans. The Irish would owe the English, and the English would owe the Irish.
Absolutely. Yep. 100%, and I think this is a really strong note to end on. And Matt Walsh has concluded a superb documentary with a profound statement, which is we do not inherit generational guilt, because if we did, everyone is guilty. A couple of quotes comes to mind, sort of when it comes to slavery. Sort of, he who is out without sin cast the first stone. Well, that's no one. And of course, the other biblical quote is about the sins of the fathers, because why should Americans, why should Europeans sort of be lambasted, be castigated for the not sins of the fathers, because at the time slavery was legal and moral, and it was our societies that had that moral awakening that I mentioned, that decided that sort of keeping people in bondage was now a moral sin. We did it. We started that, and taught it to the rest of the world, and it was often a painful lesson. So, brilliant documentary by Matt Walsh, I think, and what a strong way to end. Okay, we'll end it there. I'm really surprised how good that documentary was. And if people have felt like they've been force-fed a certain narrative for a long time, they should really watch this episode of sort of real history, because that was fantastic, really addressing each sort of era of slavery and each occurrence of it in different parts of the world. I think it was a really effective way of showing just how widespread and ubiquitous slavery was, and certainly not unique to the West. And going into that detail, regarding the Barbary slave trade, regarding the Arab and the trans-Saharan slave trade, and showing that brutality as well. The brutality was certainly not unique to the Western Hemisphere, and in many ways, it was more brutal, as it was mentioned, given what they did to African men. This is the Arabs I'm talking about. They couldn't reproduce, whereas they could reproduce in the Americas. And that doesn't mean you start saying, oh, well, it was less, that somehow American slavery was okay. That's not the point. It's about contextualizing and understanding the history. 9 out of 10. 9 out of 10, certainly, for what it's doing. I don't want to give it 10 because I feel like 10's perfection can't be achieved. Oh, the couple of errors that were in there don't really bother me. They didn't really take away from anything. Okay, yes, he made a slight mistake on the Dahomey sacrifices, like whatever. But as a correction, as a sort of corrective piece of sort of popular culture that this is, I think it did the job flawlessly. And I encourage anyone to watch this if they want an alternative to the sort of, like I say, the force-fed narrative of America uniquely evil. This is the perfect antidote to that. So well done, Matt Walsh. A very big shout out to my Patreon supporters. Their names are on the screen right now. If you'd like to join them, I'll leave a link in the description below. Now, tell me what you think about my reaction. Did you like what I said? Did you think I missed some things out, or maybe was too supportive or not supportive of Matt Walsh on certain subjects? I recommend you go and watch the documentary for yourself, because not only is it very informative, but it means you can form your own view, watch the whole thing, not only the snippets that I've reacted to. So I'm looking forward to a lively conversation in the comments. So until then, I will see you on the next one.